that Black Sabbath, in terms of their impact musically, is extremely underrated. So for example, you look at some of the top-selling artists like Fleetwood Mac or Supertramp in the 1970s. Nobody in the 1990s was trying to sound like them.
Right.
How many bands, everything from pop punk to death metal, was influenced by the riffs of Black Sabbath?
We're going to devote our energies to sports, gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings, this is Byrne coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, where I'm listening to someone pounding on my roof as they're completely renovating an apartment, a flat, a place for people to live. And I've been thinking about what's this whole Taylor Swift thing, and I have a video I'm going to do on that. And I'm trying to raise money although I have to do that in order to get my library from Alaska to here finally. So I really need help. And I started this a week or so ago, just experimenting. I will be doing more videos to try to raise money, so stay tuned for that. But meanwhile, one of the things I did was interviewed James Wallace, who has a channel dedicated to music and arts of particularly the late 20th century, but I'm sure more as well. And it's called 20th Century Music and Arts. And he agreed to come on, and we talked, made a great Anadromous dialogue. And he also discusses what his channel does. He was inspired by whatever it is I'm doing, so that felt good. But while you're watching it, you may notice a little red ticker tape line go by, and it says, you can give to help Byrne get his stuff here. And if you wish to go ahead and do that, there are links down below. They'll be active. I have to try to get out of here and go do this by March. I've already raised $600, but I've got to get to 12,000. So help out. See the link below. See the be inspired to do that while you're watching this. Meanwhile, it's a very interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Got the link. I feel like I'm talking about sausage. Ah, there we are. Okay, so it's just you, no face. That's fine. So are you there, James?
Yeah, I'm here.
Glad to hear it. So I'm going to do something right now. I want to show people a little bit of one of your videos, and then we'll talk about what you're doing over on your channel, all right? Okay, this is a recent one on must-see horror movies from the 1970s. It'll take a moment to upload.
The final film we are going to look at and examine is Lamora, which was also known as Lamora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, or The Legendary Curse of Lamora, or Lamora, Lady Dracula. Out of all three movies, this is the most unseen of the three. This film was directed by Richard Blackburn, who also plays the role of the Reverend. He was inspired by the 1970 film Count Yorga Vampire. The film was shot in Pomona, California, and debuted in April 1973 at the Garrison Theater on the Scripps College campus. The film was quickly sold to the Media Cinema Group because Blackburn felt that the audience did not react well to the movie. So these distributors edited the movie down from 118 minutes to 80 minutes, and it eventually started getting shown across the US in December 1974.
There was an old woman, no skin and bones. Oh, and she did weep and she did moan. Oh, she walked on through the streets of town. Oh.
Why don't you describe your channel for people, what you're doing over there? James?
Okay, yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. You're fine.
Okay. Yeah, I had an echo thing. Sorry, I've never live streamed before.
Well, you're doing it now. Sounds good.
Okay, okay, yeah, there's a delay at this end, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the show, I was inspired by your How We Got Here series.
Yeah.
And I wanted to look at the way music and art has evolved, particularly in the 20th century. So basically, I wanted to look at particularly the way rock music evolved in those decades between the 60s, 70s, and 90s. And I'm really interested in the way social trends operated. One of the things I found fascinating that you talked about on the How We Got Here series was how the underground mainstreamed, and then as the result of that mainstreaming, it really lost its edge and lost a lot of the greatness that made that music so interesting, because it was such a as you said, it was like the sort of underground cultural zeitgeist in the 1980s. And then when Nirvana breaks through in the 1990s, all of a sudden you have the mainstream jumping on this bandwagon, but then they're marketing youth rebellion, and you get these really deplorable mainstreaming of these sounds that were very, very authentic. So that's one aspect of why I started the channel. But now I've started to go into other things like horror movies, which is actually my favorite genre of movies. I know you're a big fan as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I particularly find the 1970s to be the most interesting era of horror movies because, as you had noted before, it takes a little time for the arts to catch up. So some of the innovations that were happening, say, in literature in maybe the 50s and then music in the 60s, cinema really catches up in the 70s, at least in sort of the American mainstream. So a lot of these sort of darker themes get really explored in the 1970s. But I'm hoping to be able to go into other things like looking at literature, looking at even comic books, looking at I really don't know a lot about visual art, but that's an area I want to know a lot more about.
Well, that's quite cool. So you're thinking of going into, in the future, you're thinking of going into a bit more visual culture. Just out of curiosity, what's the period? Are you most connected to the stuff in the 70s and 80s? Is that your favorite period?
Yeah. So I'm going to be 50 this year. So I started getting into music in the late 1980s when I was in high school. So I was a child of, like, say, the late 80s and early 90s. But the thing about that is that I was always a music historian, so that period in the late 80s was very culturally vapid, at least at the mainstream, because I didn't know much about the underground then. So I was going back to the 60s and the 70s, sort of that 65 to 75 era, to really find really good music, which was a very rich time for music that was bought by a mainstream audience. So what I find fascinating is that Frank Zappa talked about how, in the era when you had sort of these uptight people from the jazz era who were in charge of the music industry, they basically let the sort of rock and roll generation have their own, like they were allowed to have complete freedom without sort of any interference. But when that generation, that 60s generation, came of age in the 80s and started working for the record companies, they created this really conservative commercial rule book on how to market music. And that's why you have this uber commercialization in the 80s. not that there wasn't commercialization in those earlier decades, but there was this huge buying market that would allow people to listen to people like Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa would have never gone big in the 80s. He would have never had a huge audience in the 80s in that time.
Yeah, well, the 60s was an unusual time because all the rules were being broken. And do you know who John Hammond is, the producer?
Yes.
Yeah, he was so important because he was there. He discovered people like Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Benny Goodman. He was there for Bruce Springsteen, was one of his last finds, but he was also there for Bob Dylan. So you don't find people like that in the music industry anymore. People who will go out with really good taste and find these incredible musicians. And also just the size of there are I don't know how many millions of songs there are on Spotify, but if you don't know anything, you can't find anything. So
yeah,
that's
true.
So, so give me a floor plan of some of the other stuff you want to cover on your channel.
I was really fascinated by the idea of what you talked about, the irony in music. So I want to look at this connection between indie and irony. And so I'm really fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by how people can sort of culturally change so quickly. So I'll give you an example. I knew people in 1990 who were your typical hair metal person who'd be listening to Poison. They would have like sort of the mullet haircut, listen to really cheesy music. By 1994, they were playing math rock and had horn-rimmed glasses. Like the transformation in such a quick period of time. What caused that? That's what I'm interested in, because it seems like if you played something like Slint in 1987, most people would have rejected it, and then by 1994, this music is now like the hip thing. Right. What causes people to jump on bandwagons? I'm sorry, I'm on a little bit of a side tangent here, but that's what I'm fascinated.
No. But just to give people an idea, Slint is this very slow core noise. They're noisy but really slow, and there's a kind of a beauty to them as well. They're one of the first bands to really start doing this kind of slow noise, lo-fi stuff.
I miss you.
But what's interesting to me, that is one of the big questions. Why do people change what they do, how they look? Now, there's a great book called by Walker Percy called Lost in the Cosmos, which he did actually as a what should we call it? A kind of a thoughtful parody of self-help books. He did this in the mid '80s, and what he says there is, how do you get to a situation, for instance, where you have Chinese foot binding? Yeah. This really horrifying sort of fashion style. Well, it takes authority. That is to say, someone has to set the trend. He says it always takes a trendsetter. So, for instance, in the 1940s, middle of the 1930s, Clark Gable takes off his shirt in his main shirt in It Happened One Night, the movie, Frank Capra movie with Claudette Colbert. Takes off his shirt. He's not wearing any T-shirt. T-shirt sales plummet. Fade to the 1950s. Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire is suddenly wearing a T-shirt. T-shirt sales,
the kind of undershirt thing,
go up again.
Yeah.
So, but in both cases, there is someone who is a trendsetter that people consider somehow authoritative. In this case, they're both movie stars. It could be musicians, it could be rock stars, it can be the socialites, for instance, or the nobility. Princess Diana set a lot of trends. But he says it takes that. But he says, try to imagine I think also it takes a bit of lostness on the part of people. We don't know who we are, so we don't know how to remain who we are. Or, for instance, now fashion just is always changing. So there are micro trends, and people don't know how to keep up anymore. Now it's just random and chaotic.
Yeah, absolutely. But the most interesting artists are ones that completely buck the trend. So on my channel, I have a whole series on Marky Smith in the fall. Marky Smith is a guy I really admire because he never really went with the trends, and even when the trends tried to come near him, he completely rejected them. Very difficult person, but had a very unique vision that he chose to follow. And if you look at other groups, like I love the Rolling Stones, but the Rolling Stones, would go through a glam rock phase and even a little bit of a disco phase. They would go through these phases that were matching the charts. But if you have a group like the Fall of the Fall, and that's who they are. They have that sense of strong identity. And I think those are the most interesting artists. I want to also look at what you talked about, looking at noise in music. And I'm a big fan of dissonance in music, though it's not for everybody. There's very few people I can sit down and listen to Ornette Coleman with, who I like very much. So I want to explore that a little bit more. I want to explore the irony, and I want to look again at, like, sometimes you have these times in arts where even into the mainstream, some really rich stuff happens. So if you look at films in 1999, you got Fight Club, you got Magnolia, American Beauty, and Being John Malkovich. These really deep films that are actually mainstream, and that's an interesting thing too. What happened in the culture and the time that just allowed this to go through? Again, like 91 when Nirvana breaks, there was so much leading up to that in the underground, but why at that moment was that the album that broke through at that time?
Yeah, well, there is the thing with irony is, for instance, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Stalag 13. Yeah, I think it's, or is it Stalag 17? It's the one by Billy Wilder where suddenly it's like I can't remember exactly what the number is, but I think it's Stalag 17. It was made in the early 50s, late 40s, and you see the Americans there who are the prisoners of war.
Yeah,
and they're all they have a sense of irony, but it's a kind of a kidding, and it's a kind of they're not ironic about certain things, but they make a lot of jokes.
Yeah.
By the time you get to, say, Kurt Cobain, did you ever see the movie that was the year punk broke?
Yeah, I've seen that with Sonic Youth.
Yeah, and there's that scene, you remember in Madonna's movie Truth or Dare, Kevin Costner comes up and he goes, "That was really neat." And then Kurt Cobain imitates that.
Yeah, that's right.
And they just make fun of it. I mean, Madonna made fun of it because Kevin Costner was being sincere, and Madonna was already way beyond sincerity.
No.
Whereas Kurt Cobain was far beyond Madonna.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about the recent Taylor Swift movie that's kind of taking over the theaters. And I want to get to see it, but it keeps selling out everywhere here in Georgia because all these girls go there and dance to it and such. But I really want to see it because I think she's doing something that I'm not sure if I like it, but it is important. But when I watch interviews with her, she's always ironic. So she will be fluctuate between sentimentality and irony. And you'll see the same thing happening in comedies in the late 90s and aughts. Take any Adam Sandler movie. He's really ironic, but it's also sentimental, which is a very specific kind of weird postmodern American thing.
Yeah. Well, you had a bit of that with things like Seinfeld. There was that sense of irony in Seinfeld, and then like they kind of softened it with things like Frasier and Friends. You have that element of irony in there.
Right.
But,
but now it's hard to find within particularly American culture, but a lot of aspects of the Anglosphere, in particular. People who will be sincere without being fanatics. You'll find some of the extremely woke people are extremely sincere, but in a weird, fanatical, culty kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I find that interesting too. About that you brought up about the '80s tribes, because when I was going into high school, I very much remember that, and people were very much going into these like music had become an identity for them, very much so.
Right.
So you know, metalheads were considered sort of the scum of the earth, and you could, you know, and then there was the people, and then there was the punk people and the goth people and skater people, and they all had these very specific identities that people really held on to. And in the '90s, it all kind of blended together, which was very interesting.
With James Wallace, who has his channel called 20th Century Music and Arts. You should go look it up right now. And he's got videos. He's just been putting out some on the on horror in the 1970s, but he's also got one of he's got several on. He's evidently, is your favorite group Black Sabbath, or am I missing something here?
Yeah, well, I would say my top two favorite groups is kind of an odd combo, are The Fall and Black Sabbath.
Okay,
I'm arguing that.
I don't know nearly enough about The Fall, so I'm waiting for that one.
Well, I know that one's in there. It's one of my first ones.
Okay,
when I was on the lower production. I might redo it later with video clips now that I've
exactly. Well, but he's also got some stuff on prog rock, and he's. I'm glad you were inspired by my videos to go ahead and make some of your own. So, okay, James, talk to me.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm going to be looking at the way music progressed over periods of time. But you were asking me about why I like Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
My argument is that Black Sabbath, in terms of their impact musically, is extremely underrated. So, for example, you look at some of the top-selling artists like Fleetwood Mac or Supertramp in the 1970s. Nobody in the 1990s was trying to sound like them. Right. How many bands? Everything from pop punk to death metal was influenced by the riffs of Black Sabbath.
Oh, yeah. And one of the big changes that happened was when the formerly hardcore bands like Black Flag began to slow down under the influence of both Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, among others.
Yeah. And, that's a really fascinating thing, because what Black Flag were doing at the time, they're on tour constantly and their hair's all growing out. So they're now looking like the hippies that the punks were supposed to rebel against.
Right.
And one of Greg Ginn's favorite bands is, in fact, the Grateful Dead. So they start slowing down on the My War album and really to create this slow, punishing sound. But then they do this album where it's half spoken word, Family Man, and the other half is like instrumentals. And it's like wild, heavy. It's just like, you put the Grateful Dead with a whole lot of distortion on it, and that's sort of what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Totally alienating to the very conformist punk rock element.
Right. Well, that was kind of the name of the game. That's why things changed so much by the 90s. I think another really important band is the Butthole Surfers, who started
Yeah,
doing this
yeah.
just super sludgy stuff. And in about 1984 in New York, every scenester I knew was listening to the Butthole Surfers. And they were talking about, like, yeah, you got to see these guys. And you listen to it, and it just sounds like, someone's flushing a toilet over and over, through a bass guitar and a and a slashing lead guitar. It's just like so.
Yeah, for sure. They really merged the sort of hippie aesthetic with the punk aesthetic, very much so.
Yeah.
And reference that. Yeah, Gibby Haynes and all of them really interesting recording styles.
That went with the increasing irony. The postmodern irony was seeping into everything, because if you go back to the punks, they're not really ironic. Johnny Rotten he's bitterly ironic, which is a different kind of irony, but he's not postmodern ironic. He's angry, but the postmodern irony isn't usually that kind of angry. That it's not filled with rage like that.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and there was a lot of irony in the Sex Pistols, and certainly going into Pill. One album that I really like, and I have a series on British post-punk, but one album that I think is absolutely fantastic that Johnny Rotten, later John Lydon, was involved in was the Public Image Limited, their second album. It's called Second Edition or Metal Box, and he takes the influence of Can, of dub reggae, and just of various sort of dissonant sounds and mixes it all together in a really, really unique way. It's unfortunate some of the later music he put out in the 80s wasn't as great, but that album is amazing.
Well, he also started to feel the need for some sort of financial return.
Yeah.
And so he started to make music that was, this is what you want, this is what you get. Fairly commercial piece. I like it, but it's certainly not the first two Pill albums.
No. But yeah, but one of the most fascinating things about British post-punk is that because rock had sort of been declared dead, in those years between, like, say 78 and about 81, there were so many bands putting out unique stuff because everyone's kind of trying something different in their own way, but there's not really a formula yet. So that's when you get the great albums by Wire, Gang of Four, Nick Cave and the Birthday Party. They went over to England to be part of that scene. And they're very influenced by another group called the Pop Group. Really, really interesting, dissonant, free jazz noise is really cool. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm into. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't follow a lot of new music these days. I feel like there's sort of like everything's on pause since about the year 2000 in some ways. It's kind of odd.
Yeah. No, I really do think rock music. Someone talked about this with jazz. They said at a certain point and you can say by the mid to late 70s, jazz ceased to be a music of origination and became a music of interpretation. So that most of the styles, with the exception of what John Zorn was going to do.
Yes.
And, but what John Zorn did was the final ironic twist by essentially making each style his improvisation.
Yeah, and what was so interesting about John Zorn is he's jamming with people from the extreme metal scene, from the extreme Japanese noise scene.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
And then he has those pieces like Spillane and stuff where it's referencing like Hardboiled Detective. Yeah, very interesting artist.
I hate to tell you this, but before I left New York City, there was like a whole month of all of his different bands playing at the Knitting Factory, and I went to a couple of those nights, and it was pretty amazing.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the Knitting Factory scene must have been really amazing in New York. What were some great shows that you saw in New York in the 80s?
Oh, I'll tell you what. It would take too long. So here's what I'm going to tell you to do. Find me again when I do this, and I will be thinking about a list of some of those, and we'll go from there.
All right, that sounds cool.
Yeah,
that sounds cool.
And I am going to say farewell to you. And
Okay,
thank
great.
you so much for coming aboard and your contribution. And folks, if you want more on music and 20th century popular culture and whatnot, look for James's channel called 20th Century Music and Arts. Go subscribe, and we will see you later. And then
Okay,
you bring
thanks
that
a lot,
question later.
Thanks a lot, Bern. I really appreciate it, and all the support you give me for the channel.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, take care, man.
Okay, so there you are. We have listened to James talking. Go check out his channel. There's a link for that somewhere around here, maybe over there. And think about what you can do to help me get my library here. And it's going to require some friendship on your part, some love, shall we say. And it would be an act of love, because I'm sure a lot of you don't have that much money, and I appreciate everything that I will get and have gotten already. So we'll just call it a day. We'll be back very soon. This is Bern saying what the Georgians say. Droabit from Tbilisi.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.